Welcome, my dear listeners, to a realm where the echoes of the past haunt the present, and the barnyard isn't just home to livestock, but to secrets buried deep in the soil. Tonight we embark on a trilogy of terror, where the ordinary turns sinister, and the whispering winds carry tales of blood, betrayal, and things far worse than death. Step cautiously, for these are not your average bedtime stories. These are Barnyard Tales, and they are not for the faint of heart. Jonah gripped the steering wheel tightly as the long gravel driveway stretched out before him. The farm looked even more remote than he'd imagined. Isolated fields rolling out to the horizon, dotted with gnarled trees and overgrown fences. The farmhouse stood in the distance, a pale ghost of its former self, with paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. But this wasn't just any house. This was where his grandfather, his newly discovered family, lived. For Jonah, it still didn't feel real. He'd grown up believing his grandparents were long gone, but a genealogy search had changed everything. To his amazement, he'd uncovered a living grandfather, John Williams, living out here in solitude. After sending a hopeful letter, he'd been floored to receive a reply. "Jonah, I've waited my whole life, wondering if I had family out there. Come anytime. The farm's open to you. Your Grandpa John." The words had been enough to convince Jonah to make the 16-hour drive to meet the man who had seemed like a ghost until now. He parked the car and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. His excitement warred with a growing sense of unease. The house loomed larger as he approached, and the barn, further back, cast a strange shadow in the fading light of evening. The front door creaked open, and a tall man stepped out onto the porch. He was wiry and weathered, his face rugged and creased with years of labor under the sun. His eyes, sharp and gray, studied Jonah for a moment before a smile spread across his lips. "You must be Jonah," the man said, his voice gruff but kind. Jonah grinned, relief washing over him. "Yeah, that's me. It's great to finally meet you." The man nodded, stepping forward and clasping Jonah's hand firmly. "John Williams, your grandfather." They stood there for a moment, Jonah taking in the surreal weight of the meeting. "I wasn't sure I'd ever meet you," Jonah admitted. "Well," John said with a chuckle, "you're here now, and I'm glad. Come inside, get settled. The place isn't much, but it's yours while you're here." The house was as rustic as Jonah had expected, wooden floors that creaked with every step, a fireplace that still bore the smell of old ashes, and furniture that had seen better decades. Yet, it felt welcoming, if a bit lonely. Over dinner, John regaled Jonah with stories about the farm, although he remained vague about the past. Jonah didn't press him, figuring he needed time to open up. After they'd eaten, John showed him to a room upstairs. "It's not much," he said, gesturing to the small bed and dresser, "but it's yours." "Thanks, Grandpa," Jonah said. "One thing," John added, his expression suddenly serious. "You're welcome to anything in the house, but don't go poking around the barn. That's where I do my private work. Understood?" Jonah blinked, surprised at the sharpness in his tone. "Yeah, of course, no problem." John nodded, his face softening into a smile again. "Good. Get some rest." That night, Jonah lay in bed, the house eerily quiet around him. The ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway was the only sound. He had just started to drift off when the creak of footsteps startled him awake. They were slow, deliberate, moving down the hall. Jonah sat up, his heart pounding. "Grandpa?" he called softly. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. He stared at the faint line of light under the door and froze. 2 shadows, feet, stood there, unmoving. Jonah's throat went dry. "Grandpa, is that you?" No answer. The feet didn't move. Minutes stretched into hours, and the shadows remained. Jonah lay back in bed, his eyes glued to the door. Fear coursed through him, the thought of standing up and checking almost paralyzing him. He stayed awake all night, watching, waiting. When the first light of dawn broke, the shadows were gone. Over breakfast, Jonah brought it up. "Were you outside my room last night?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. John glanced at him over his coffee mug. "Number, I went to bed early. Must have been your imagination." Jonah nodded slowly, but he couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. That evening, Jonah decided to explore the property while John was in town. The barn caught his eye, its massive weathered doors locked with a thick chain. Something about it seemed wrong. He stepped closer, the air around it feeling heavier, more oppressive. As he walked around the back, his foot snagged on something, and he fell to the ground. Looking back, his blood ran cold. A hand jutted out of the earth, skeletal and dry, the flesh shriveled like old parchment. With shaking hands, Jonah unearthed more. The body wore a pair of faded overalls. The face, though decayed, was unmistakable. It was his grandfather, the real John Williams. Jonah stumbled toward the house, panic rising in his chest. The sound of a car pulling up stopped him in his tracks. He turned to see John, or whoever the man was, stepping out, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "You weren't supposed to find that," the man said, his voice colder now, devoid of warmth. Jonah's breath hitched. "Who are you? What did you do to him?" The man's lips curled into a smile that sent chills down Jonah's spine. "You shouldn't ask questions you don't want answers to." He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a rusted axe. "I told you to stay out of the barn. Guess you've got the same problem he did, too curious for your own good." Jonah bolted for the barn, hoping to find something to defend himself. Inside, the air was thick with rot. The walls were lined with grotesque trophies, stretched skins, jars of preserved organs, bones arranged in strange patterns. The imposter entered behind him, his footsteps deliberate. "This is where I do my work," he growled. "You'll fit right in." Jonah grabbed a pitchfork and swung it, the prongs catching the man's shoulder. He barely flinched. Instead, he howled, a guttural, inhuman sound, as his face seemed to ripple, the skin shifting unnaturally. The fight was chaotic, blood and screams filling the barn. Jonah managed to knock over a lantern, and flames erupted, spreading quickly across the dry wood. The man roared, lunging at Jonah, but the fire consumed him before he could strike. Jonah stumbled outside, collapsing in the dirt, as the barn roared with flames. Behind him, the imposter's screams turned to unnatural howls before falling silent. By dawn, the barn was a smoldering ruin. But Jonah knew this wasn't over. Whatever that thing had been, it wasn't human, and it had left its mark on him, on this place. The barn stood as little more than a husk now, charred beams clawing at the sky like the ribcage of some long-dead beast. Jonah hadn't been back since that night, but he'd heard the whispers, small-town gossip about the fire and the man who'd vanished with it. When he got the call from the new owners of the farm asking for his help, his first instinct was to refuse. But something about their voice, a strained urgency masked by politeness, drew him in. The farmhouse looked different this time, scrubbed clean of its age. The new owners, a young couple named Harold and Sylvia, had clearly been working hard to restore the property. Fresh paint covered the exterior, and the yard was neatly trimmed. But Jonah noticed something immediately. The barnyard was eerily quiet. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed hesitant to stir the grass. "Thank you for coming," Sylvia said as she greeted him at the door. She was petite, her eyes shadowed by worry. Harold loomed behind her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "We didn't know who else to call," Harold said. His voice was steady, but his hands fidgeted. "You were the last person who stayed here. You must have noticed things." Jonah stiffened. "What things?" The couple exchanged a glance. "It's the barn," Sylvia said, "or where the barn used to be. Every night we hear them, scratching, flapping, sometimes whispers." Jonah's throat tightened. "Them?" Harold nodded grimly. "The crows, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They come at night and just sit there, in the ruins, staring at the house." That evening, Jonah stayed for dinner. Harold and Sylvia spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the windows as the sun sank behind the horizon. Jonah didn't say much. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the unseen, creeping closer with each passing minute. After dinner, he stepped outside. The air was colder than it should have been for summer, the kind of chill that burrowed into the bones. Jonah's boots crunched against the gravel as he walked toward the barn's remains. The moon cast long shadows across the ruins, and Jonah's breath caught as he saw them. The crows. They perched silently along the jagged beams, their feathers shimmering like oil slicks in the moonlight. Their eyes, hundreds of glinting black orbs, were fixed on him. He took a step closer, and the silence broke. The crows erupted in a cacophony of caws, wings beating furiously as they swirled into the air. Jonah staggered back, his heart pounding as the black cloud circled above him. Then he heard it. Beneath the noise of the birds, there was a voice, faint, whispering, "Leave." Inside the house, Harold and Sylvia were waiting, their faces pale. "You heard it, didn't you?" Sylvia asked. Jonah nodded. "What's happened here?" Sylvia bit her lip, hesitating, but Harold spoke. "It started a month ago. At first it was just the birds. We thought it was natural, crows scavenging the ruins. But then we found the first one." "The first what?" Jonah asked. Harold didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the kitchen and opened a drawer, pulling out a small wooden box. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside was a single, blackened feather and a sliver of something metallic. Jonah leaned closer and felt a shiver run through him. It wasn't metal. It was bone, polished to an unnatural sheen. "We found it buried in the barnyard," Harold said, "and there are more. Dozens of them, scattered beneath the soil." Sylvia spoke then, her voice trembling. "It's like they're building something out of the bones." That night, Jonah stayed in the spare bedroom, the same room where he'd once seen shadows lingering beneath the door. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of wings set his nerves on edge. Around midnight, he heard it. The faint tap-tap-tap of claws on glass. He turned his head slowly toward the window. A crow was perched on the sill, its beady eyes staring straight at him. Jonah held his breath, and the bird cocked its head, as though listening. Then it spoke. "Leave." The voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a spike of ice down Jonah's spine. He sat up, and the crow flew off, its wings disappearing into the darkness. By morning, Jonah had made up his mind. "We need to dig," he told Harold and Sylvia. "Dig?" Sylvia asked. "Why?" "There's something buried in that barnyard," Jonah said. "Something those crows are protecting. I don't know what it is, but if we want to stop this, we have to find it." Harold hesitated, but eventually nodded. They armed themselves with shovels and headed out to the ruins. The digging was slow, the soil packed and stubborn, but as they worked, the crows began to gather. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds, their black forms lining the beams and nearby trees. "They're watching us," Sylvia whispered. Jonah ignored them, focusing on the ground. His shovel struck something hard, and he knelt to uncover it. It was a chest, old and rusted, its surface etched with strange symbols. Jonah hesitated, then forced it open. Inside were bones, hundreds of tiny bird-like bones, and a single human skull, its surface carved with intricate markings. The crows erupted into a deafening frenzy, their cries merging into a single, terrible scream. The skull seemed to pulse in Jonah's hands, the air around it growing thick and heavy. "Put it back," Sylvia screamed, but Jonah didn't. He hurled the skull against a beam, shattering it. The crows screamed louder, their black cloud descending on the barnyard like a storm. Jonah felt claws raking his skin, beaks tearing at his clothes. He stumbled toward the house, dragging Harold and Sylvia with him. When they reached the porch, the crows stopped. The storm of feathers dissolved, the birds retreating to the trees in eerie silence. The barnyard was empty now, the chest and its contents gone. But Jonah knew they hadn't won. Something had been disturbed, something ancient and restless, and it was still watching. The farm had been sold again. Jonah heard about it through the whispers of small-town gossip, how the last owners, Harold and Sylvia, had vanished without a trace. Their furniture remained untouched, their car still parked in the driveway, but the couple themselves were gone, as if swallowed by the earth. Jonah told himself it wasn't his problem anymore. He'd barely escaped with his life the last time he'd been here, leaving the ashes of the barn smoldering behind him, but something had been gnawing at him ever since. The events of that night hadn't stopped haunting his dreams, and now, with this new disappearance, the pull was too strong to resist. So Jonah returned. The farmhouse was eerily familiar, but the changes were stark. The cheerful touches Harold and Sylvia had added, fresh paint, tidy landscaping, were gone, reclaimed by time and neglect. The barnyard was overgrown, the grass tangled and wild. The ruins of the barn had been cleared away, leaving a patch of exposed, raw earth. Jonah stood in the yard, clutching his bag. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Closure? Answers? A way to make the nightmares stop? The silence pressed against his ears. No birds, no insects, just the wind whispering through the tall grass. He wasn't alone. Jonah spun around, his breath catching as he saw a figure standing at the edge of the property. A man, tall and wiry, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. His face was in shadow, but Jonah recognized the silhouette. It was him, the man that killed his grandfather. "No," Jonah whispered. "You're dead." The figures didn't move. Jonah backed away toward the house, his pulse hammering. When he glanced back, the man was gone. Jonah spent the first night in the house, his nerves on edge. He brought a flashlight, a crowbar, and a revolver he'd borrowed from a friend who didn't ask questions. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood. Jonah tried to tell himself it was just the house settling, but he knew better. He could feel it, a presence, watching him. It started around midnight, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just outside his bedroom door. Jonah gripped the crowbar, staring at the faint line of light beneath the door, and then the shadows appeared. Feet, motionless, just like before. "Who's there?" Jonah called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The feet didn't move. Jonah clenched his jaw, his body trembling as he inched toward the door. He threw it open, flashlight blazing. The hallway was empty. The next day, Jonah decided to investigate the barnyard. He hadn't come this far to turn back now. The patch of earth where the barn once stood was strangely bare. No grass, no weeds, just dirt. It felt wrong beneath his boots, soft and spongy, as if the ground itself had decayed. As he walked the perimeter, something caught his eye, a thin metal rod sticking out of the soil. Jonah crouched and began digging, his hands working frantically until he unearthed an iron door, rusted and ancient. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The door had no handle, only a ring etched with symbols that looked older than anything Jonah could place. He tugged on it, and with a groan, the door creaked open. A chill wafted up from the darkness below. Jonah hesitated, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than his fear. He climbed down into the darkness, his flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. The tunnel beneath the barnyard was narrow and damp, its walls lined with stones slick with moisture. Jonah moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He didn't know how long he walked before he reached the chamber. It was circular, the walls carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly in the dark. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it lay a book, bound in what looked like blackened leather. Jonah's flashlight flickered as he approached. The air was heavy, humming with an energy that made his skin crawl. He reached for the book, his fingers trembling as he opened the cover. The pages were filled with symbols, images of birds, and something else, something monstrous. A figure with wings outstretched, its face hidden behind a jagged beak-like mask. The Watcher. Jonah heard the voice then, soft and sibilant, like the rustle of feathers. "You shouldn't have come back." Jonah turned, his flashlight catching movement in the shadows. The imposter stepped forward, his face no longer human. His skin was stretched and cracked, his eyes glinting like a crow's, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. "You burned me once," the imposter hissed, "but the Watcher endures, and now you've brought yourself to me." The ground trembled, the runes glowing brighter as a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. Jonah staggered back, the book slipping from his hands. The shadows coalesced into a form, tall, with massive wings that unfurled to scrape the walls. Its face was hidden behind a beak-like mask, but its eyes burned with malice. The Watcher had awoken. Jonah ran. He didn't look back, didn't care where the tunnel led, as long as it was away from the thing that had risen behind him. The sound of wings filled the air, a deafening cacophony that drowned out his panicked breaths. He burst out into the barnyard, collapsing onto the dirt. The silence that followed was suffocating. When he turned back toward the barnyard, the ground was still. The iron door was gone. For a moment, Jonah thought he'd escaped, but then he heard it, a single caw. He looked up. The sky was black with crows.